For almost 250 years, our people were held in bondage. And today, this period of history has come to be known by an ancient Swahili word. It's called the Maafa. And it began when the first Africans were shackled to the bottom of a slave ship. But the irony is that it did not end when the slaves were freed. In fact, it hasn't ended yet. A hidden racial agenda is keeping the Maafa alive into the 21st century.
Well, I hope that clip got your attention because there is so much more where that came from. This is from a DVD entitled Maafa 21 Black Genocide in the 21st Century America. I saw this some time ago before it was updated yet again in April of this year. I wish I could tell you that there was no new information to add to this story of planned black genocide, but that is hardly the case. Mark Crutcher has such a heart for the preborn. He has been working in the pro-life movement for so many years. He is the writer and the producer, by the way, of Maafa 21. He's an author. He's the founder and president of Life Dynamics Incorporated. And Mark, you cannot watch this without getting just crushed in spirit. And the way all of the dots connect is simply overwhelming, starting with the idea that eugenics reared its ugly head shortly after slaves were emancipated in this country. I had no clue whatsoever. But there was a plan. They were going to send African Americans back to Africa. That failed dismally. So the idea was, well, we simply have to get rid of African Americans through eugenics. Unbelievable.
Yeah, it really is, and thank you for having me on, Janet. You know, it's been a while since you and I have talked, but
it has been,
and a lot of that time I've been spent doing the research on this. But it's hard to believe until you start, as you a moment ago said, connecting the dots, that something that started actually before slavery ended is what led to the legalization of abortion and continues to evolve today. The next dot to be connected is government funding of abortion, which we see happening. And the dot after that will be government-forced abortion, which you're already having people in this country say might have to be a reality one day. So this is an ongoing thing. It's not something that ended 150 years ago or 50 years ago. It is ongoing as you and I speak.
And you make that point at the very end of the DVD, and that's why this is a wake-up call for our friends who are listening to us today. I was not surprised, but I think it was important to point out the historical intersection as well as the familial connection between the ideas of eugenics and evolution, right?
Oh, absolutely. I had never known until we started researching this. I knew a lot of this eugenic stuff, I think like most people do know that it existed and basically what it was about. The man who actually coined the phrase eugenics, or the term eugenics, was a man named Francis Galton, and he is today called the father of eugenics. He, like I said, he made up the word eugenics, and it was his theories that started the eugenics campaign. He was the first cousin of Charles Darwin, and I knew about Galton. I basically knew who he was, and of course knew who Charles Darwin was, but I had no idea until I started researching this that they were first cousins and worked closely together. And when you research, what you find out is that these guys basically were a team. Darwin was the guy who gave the philosophical underpinnings to eugenics, and Galton was the guy who carried them out. And it started a process that, and I think we do a good job of connecting the dots and showing people how something that did start before the end of slavery, one dot led to the next one, and when that dot died out, the next dot took over, and it just evolved into today's the latest manifestation of eugenics is legalized abortion. And
absolutely.
I think one of the most shocking things for me when I started researching this was if I had come on the show, let's say 2 years ago, and said, Janet, who were the founders of the anti-abortion movement in America? You and I probably would have agreed. It was organizations like the Catholic Church and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and maybe National Right to Life and American Life League with Judy Brown and Joe Scheidler. We'd have said all these people were the founders. The reality is that the first anti-abortion activists in this country were the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam. Because in the 1960s, they saw what was going on. They picked up on it before anyone else did. They saw that the legalization of abortion was a tool that was aimed right at them. And it came at the end of the period during which they were doing sterilizations. And when they saw that the sterilization movement was going down the tubes because the federal courts were starting to rule that the sterilization boards that were in 31 states were unconstitutional, they had to move on to the next strategy, and the next strategy was legalized abortion. And that explains why you can have a lot of these people say, oh, but Planned Parenthood was always against abortion. Look at these statements that they made back in the 40s and 50s. And yes, all these eugenics organizations did make statements in opposition to abortion because they didn't think they could sell it to the American people. But when sterilization started failing, they all did a 180-degree turn. And that's what alerted these civil rights groups back in the 1960s that something was up. One of the most, of course, outspoken was Jesse Jackson, and we've got a lot of quotes in the DVD from him talking about that very subject.
Yes, and then, as you point out, and some of his quotes are amazing, there are 100% pro-life. But then, as was pointed out, and by the way, 90% of the people who appear in the DVD are, in fact, African Americans, and they're the historians telling this story. When he decided to run for president, unfortunately, money does strange things to people, and he knew that the pro-abortion community had deep pockets, and so he changed his position. And yet, historically, some of the strongest pro-life statements I've ever heard came from Jesse Jackson.
Absolutely. I mean, he was an eloquent speaker for the pro-life movement and actually backed a complete constitutional ban on abortion in all circumstances. So he was hardcore. But as you say, when he decided he wanted to run for president, by the time he had done that, the what I call the population control or eugenics cartel was completely in charge of both political parties, not just the Democratic Party, but I think we make the point that and we have the quotes to prove it.
Oh, absolutely.
And that at the very top levels of these two political parties, the population control cartel was in absolute 100% control. And Jesse Jackson knew that he couldn't run for president and get the money that he needed and get the backing that he needed without becoming pro-abortion. And it's really strange when you look at the timeline here. You have a man who was at one point saying that abortion is genocide. And he asked the question, what will become of our nation? What becomes of a nation that can wipe out the lives of unborn children at its whim? Where would that nation be 20 years down the road? So he was right on target. But then within days after making a statement like that, he says the number one civil rights issue of the day is a woman's right to choose.
Sad. Well, that goes back to the scripture about the love of money, right? It just changes everything, Mark. Let me go, so that we don't go over this so quickly that people don't understand what we're talking about. Give a working definition, if you'd be so kind, as to what the word eugenics means.
Eugenics was something that was embraced by people like Darwin and Francis Galton because they believed in evolution, obviously, and they believed that mankind did not have to wait around and rely on evolution to take place naturally, that you could accelerate the process by artificially limiting the birth rates and the survival rates of what they viewed as inferior groups. And if you did that, you profited the whole human race. What you have to understand that at the core of eugenics and at the core of evolution is the belief that if you look at life as a continuum from the lowest form of primate up to the highest form of human, this is what they believed. There was a continuum that went on between those two extremes. At the place where you have the highest form of primate, which they said was the gorilla, and the lowest form of human, which they said was the Aborigine and the African, Galton and Darwin believed that the gap between those two was almost non-existent, that there was a very small gap between the highest form of primate, the gorilla, and the lowest form of human, the African and the Aborigine. But that if you made that gap wider, that the human race got better. And the way you make that gap wider is to eliminate the people that are closest to the gorilla. And that's the fundamental basis of eugenics and